It was a regular Thursday afternoon in the small town of Brooksville, a quiet community where people still waved at neighbors and trusted their local police. Colonel Margaret Ellison, a retired Army officer with over 30 years of service, had just finished her morning jog when she decided to stop by the local supermarket for some groceries. She was in her early 60s, tall, proud, and carried herself with the calm confidence that came from decades of leadership and discipline. Her skin was dark brown, her hair neatly pulled back and her eyes sharp and observant. She had fought for her country overseas, trained soldiers, and earned the respect of everyone who worked under her command. Now she lived a peaceful life, volunteering at a veterans center and occasionally giving talks at schools about service and sacrifice. The supermarket was moderately busy that day. The air smelled like fresh bread and cleaning supplies, and the usual hum of activity filled the aisles. Margaret walked slowly, scanning the shelves as she added items to her cart. She wasn't in a rush. She liked this store because it felt familiar, like stepping into a place where everyone knew each other's names. She smiled politely at a few people she recognized: cashiers, fellow shoppers, even the security guard near the entrance. As she reached for a box of cereal on a high shelf, someone brushed past her roughly. She turned slightly, surprised. It was a man in his mid-40s wearing what looked like a police uniform. His face was red, his jaw clenched, and he muttered something under his breath before moving forward without looking at her. Margaret ignored him, thinking nothing of it. She had seen all kinds of people during her time in the military, some kind, some cruel, most just trying to get through life. But then she heard it, a low, bitter voice behind her. "This is our country, not yours." She turned around fully, this time, facing the man who had spoken. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes locked onto hers with a look of barely contained anger. She raised an eyebrow but kept her tone calm. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said, taking a step closer. "People like you shouldn't be here, taking jobs, acting like you belong." Margaret's heart tightened, but she didn't let it show. She had faced worse in war zones. This was different, but she knew how to handle confrontation. "I'm a retired U.S. Army officer," she said evenly. "I've served this country for over 3 decades. I think I have every right to be here." The man snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. You expect me to believe that? You don't look like any officer I've ever seen." A few nearby shoppers paused what they were doing, glancing nervously between the two. Some stepped back, others watched from behind carts or shelves, unsure if things would escalate. One young woman quietly pulled out her phone, ready to record just in case. Margaret remained calm. "You can believe whatever you want," she said, turning back to her cart. "I'm not here to argue." But the man wasn't done. He stepped forward again, now inches from her. "You think you're better than us?" he snapped. "You think your kind built this country? No, real Americans did that." Margaret exhaled slowly, trying to keep control of the situation. She had no idea where this hatred was coming from, but she had seen it before. Ignorance wrapped in pride, fear disguised as anger. "Sir," she said firmly, "I'm not going to fight with you. Please, just walk away." He didn't. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled something out. At first, Margaret thought it was a badge. Then she realized what it really was, a gun. Her instincts kicked in immediately. Years of training took over. She raised her hands slowly, keeping her voice steady. "Put the gun down," she said. "No one needs to get hurt." The man's hand trembled slightly, but his grip on the weapon was firm. "You talk too much," he spat. "You think you're tough because you wear a uniform. Let's see how brave you are now." Panic spread through the store. Shoppers screamed and ran toward the exits. Employees ducked behind counters. Someone dropped a bag of apples, rolling across the floor like scattered marbles. The cashier, a young man named David, quickly grabbed the phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "Please," Margaret said again, her voice calm but firm. "Let's talk. Put the gun down." The man's eyes darted around, sweat forming on his forehead. "You don't understand," he growled. "This isn't your place. It never was." "I was born here," Margaret replied. "I grew up here. I fought for this country, and I'm not afraid of you." For a moment, silence fell over the aisle. Even the background noise seemed to fade. The only sounds were their breathing and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Then, footsteps. Fast, heavy boots hitting the tiled floor. Police officers had arrived. Within seconds, they entered the scene, guns drawn, shouting orders. "Drop the weapon. Now." The off-duty cop hesitated, eyes wild, body tense. Then, almost in slow motion, he started to lower the gun, but not fast enough. One of the officers tackled him, slamming him to the ground while another wrestled the weapon from his grip. The struggle lasted only a few seconds before the man was cuffed and dragged to his feet. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding. Then, as if waking from a dream, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm okay," she told the officers. "I'm fine." One of them nodded, clearly shaken. "Ma'am, are you sure? We need to get you checked out." She shook her head. "I'll be fine, just take him away." The officers obeyed, dragging the man, who was now screaming curses and threats, toward the exit. As they passed, several customers who had been hiding peeked out, watching in stunned silence. Some clapped softly when the man disappeared through the doors. Later, the video of the incident would go viral. Captured by the young woman who had recorded it, the footage showed everything: the racial slurs, the threat, and Margaret's unwavering composure throughout. It spread like wildfire across social media, sparking outrage and support in equal measure. Within hours, the story was picked up by national news outlets. People were shocked, not just at the act itself, but at the fact that the aggressor had been a police officer. Details began to surface about his history: complaints of excessive force, reports of racial profiling, and a disciplinary record that had somehow gone unnoticed. By the next morning, the department had issued a statement. The officer had been suspended pending investigation. By noon, they announced he had been fired permanently. Public pressure was immense, and the mayor himself made a speech condemning racism and calling for greater accountability within law enforcement. Margaret, meanwhile, refused to hide. Though shaken, she continued with her daily routine. She gave interviews, spoke at rallies, and became a symbol of strength and dignity in the face of prejudice. Her story inspired thousands, especially young people of color considering careers in public service. And though she never asked for it, she became a hero once again, not just for what she had done in uniform, but for how she had faced hate with courage and grace. The days following the incident were a blur for Colonel Margaret Ellison. The supermarket had closed briefly after the confrontation, giving employees time to recover and process what they had witnessed. When it reopened, security was tighter, and signs of support for Margaret were everywhere. Handmade posters in the windows, messages taped to the walls thanking her for her service and strength. Customers who had once just nodded politely now stopped to shake her hand or offer hugs. She appreciated their kindness but remained humble, always insisting that she had done nothing extraordinary. Meanwhile, the fired officer's name was released to the public. His name was Carl Dawson, a 10-year veteran of the Brooksville Police Department. News outlets dug into his past, uncovering multiple complaints from citizens over the years. Accusations of racial profiling, rough treatment during arrests, and an aggressive attitude toward minorities. Some reports had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, while others had led to minor reprimands that never seemed to stick. His suspension and eventual firing came swiftly, but many questioned how he had kept his job for so long despite the red flags. Public outrage grew as more details surfaced. Protests began outside the police station, with people demanding justice not only for Margaret, but for all those who had suffered at the hands of officers like Dawson. Local leaders held emergency meetings, and national figures began speaking out about systemic issues within law enforcement. Social media was flooded with posts showing Margaret's military medals, old photos of her in uniform, and clips of her calm demeanor during the confrontation. She became a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of hatred. Despite the attention, Margaret tried to keep her life as normal as possible. She continued volunteering at the Veterans Center, where younger soldiers looked up to her even more than before. One young woman, a recruit preparing for basic training, approached her one day and said, "You showed us how to stay strong when people try to break you." Margaret smiled gently and replied, "That's what service means. Not just fighting battles, but standing up for what's right." Still, the emotional weight of the incident lingered. Late at night, when the world was quiet, she would sometimes sit on her porch and stare into the darkness, replaying the moment when Dawson had pointed the gun at her. She told herself she had handled it well, but the memory still sent chills through her body. She knew fear was natural, but she refused to let it control her. Instead, she focused on moving forward, determined to use this painful experience for something greater. The video of the encounter continued to circulate online. It was shared millions of times across platforms, analyzed by legal experts, civil rights advocates, and everyday citizens alike. Some used it as a lesson in de-escalation, praising Margaret for staying calm and composed under extreme pressure. Others saw it as proof of the deep-rooted racism that still plagued American society. A few conspiracy theorists claimed the whole thing was staged, but most people saw the truth clearly. Dawson had acted out of prejudice, and Margaret had responded with courage. A journalist named Lisa Carter reached out to Margaret, requesting an interview. Lisa worked for a major news network and had covered similar stories before. At first, Margaret declined, saying she didn't want to relive the moment on national television. But Lisa persisted, explaining that her story could help bring awareness to the issue of bias in policing. After some thought, Margaret agreed. The interview took place in a small studio in the city. Cameras rolled, lights shone bright, and Lisa asked careful, thoughtful questions. Margaret answered honestly, never raising her voice or showing anger. She spoke about her years in the military, the respect she had earned, and the pain of being judged not by her actions but by the color of her skin. She also addressed the broader problem, how people like Dawson should never have been allowed to wear a badge in the first place. When the interview aired, it struck a chord with viewers. People called into radio shows, wrote letters to editors, and posted heartfelt messages online. Many praised Margaret's grace under pressure, while others admitted they had never truly understood the struggles faced by Black Americans until seeing her story. Some white viewers said they were ashamed of how people like Dawson had tarnished the image of law enforcement. As the weeks passed, the legal case against Dawson moved forward. He was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful possession of a firearm in a public space, and making terroristic threats. Prosecutors built a strong case, using witness statements, surveillance footage, and the viral video that had exposed his actions to the world. His defense team argued that he had been provoked, claiming he feared for his safety, but the judge rejected that argument, pointing out that Dawson had initiated the confrontation and escalated it unnecessarily. During this time, Margaret received letters from strangers. Some were handwritten notes of gratitude, others were emails, from young women inspired to join the military because of her example. One message stood out, a letter from a teenage girl who had once considered quitting school but decided to stay after watching Margaret's interview. "You made me believe I can be strong," the girl wrote. Margaret read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer next to her medals. Back in Brooksville, the community rallied around Margaret. A local high school invited her to speak at their graduation ceremony. She accepted, delivering a powerful speech about perseverance, unity, and the importance of standing up for justice. Students listened intently, teachers applauded, and parents whispered among themselves about how proud they were to live in the same town as someone like her. At the same time, calls for reform within the police department grew louder. Activists demanded new policies to prevent officers with problematic records from remaining on the force. City officials promised changes, though many remained skeptical about whether real progress would follow. Still, the pressure helped push several important conversations forward. One evening, Margaret sat down with a group of retired officers and current police recruits to discuss the future of law enforcement. They met in a small conference room at the community center, sharing coffee and honest discussions. Margaret spoke about the need for better training, stricter hiring practices, and more accountability. We can't afford to let hate hide behind a badge, she said firmly. If we're going to protect our communities, we must serve everyone equally. The conversation lasted hours, ending only when the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark blue. As people left, they thanked Margaret for her insight, some shaking her hand, others offering warm embraces. She walked home slowly, feeling tired but satisfied. By the time the trial date arrived, the entire country was watching. Dawson faced a packed courtroom, his lawyers arguing for leniency, while prosecutors pushed for maximum consequences. The jury listened to testimony from witnesses, reviewed the video, and heard Margaret's account of the event. She remained composed throughout, answering questions without hesitation. After deliberating for 2 full days, the jury reached a verdict. Dawson was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to prison, citing the severity of his actions and the danger he had posed to innocent lives. As he was led away in handcuffs, Margaret felt a sense of closure, not because justice had fully erased the pain, but because it had finally been acknowledged. She returned home that night, opened her front door, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, peaceful. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and looked out at the stars. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because she had reminded it that courage still mattered. The days after Carl Dawson's sentencing were filled with mixed emotions across Brooksville. Some residents felt a sense of relief, believing that justice had finally been served. Others, however, remained skeptical, arguing that one conviction wouldn't erase years of systemic problems within the police department. The city buzzed with conversations in cafes, schools, and town halls. People debated what needed to change, how trust could be rebuilt, and whether real reform was even possible. For Colonel Margaret Ellison, life didn't return to normal overnight. Though she tried to keep up her usual routine, morning jogs, volunteering at the Veterans Center, grocery shopping when necessary, the world around her had shifted. She was no longer just a respected retired officer. She was a national figure, a symbol of resilience against injustice. Her mailbox overflowed with letters from strangers, some supportive, some questioning why someone like her had ever faced such treatment in the first place. One afternoon, while sitting in her backyard with a cup of tea, Margaret received a call from a local university professor named Dr. Alan Reyes. He had seen her interview on national television and wanted to invite her to speak at an upcoming symposium on civil rights and law enforcement accountability. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't new to her. She had trained soldiers, led troops, and given countless briefings. But this was different. This time, she would be talking about herself, about the moment she had stood face to face with hatred and refused to back down. After thinking it over, she agreed. If my story can help someone else, she told herself, then I have to share it. The event took place 2 weeks later in a packed auditorium. Students, professors, activists, and journalists filled the seats. Margaret walked onto the EI stage with quiet confidence, dressed in a modest blazer and slacks. She didn't need flashy words or dramatic speeches. Her presence alone commanded attention. As she spoke, the room fell silent. She recounted the incident in the supermarket not with anger but with clarity. She described the fear, the tension, and most importantly, the lessons learned. She didn't paint herself as a hero, nor did she villainize Dawson entirely. Instead, she focused on the bigger picture, the importance of accountability, the dangers of unchecked bias, and the need for better training in law enforcement. We cannot allow hate to hide behind a badge, she said firmly. Every officer must understand that their duty is to protect all people, not just those they feel comfortable with. Her words resonated deeply. After the speech, several students approached her, asking questions about leadership, service, and how to fight injustice in everyday life. One young woman who was considering joining the military told Margaret, "You made me believe I can do something meaningful with my life." Margaret smiled gently and replied, "That's exactly what you will do." Back in Brooksville, the community continued to heal. The mayor announced plans to review hiring practices within the police department, promising more rigorous background checks and mandatory bias training for all officers. Activists pushed for further reforms, including civilian oversight boards and stricter disciplinary measures for misconduct. While many remained cautious, hoping these changes wouldn't fade with time, others saw them as a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, Margaret became more involved in advocacy work. She met with lawmakers, participated in roundtable discussions on policing reform, and even helped draft a proposal for a national initiative aimed at improving relations between law enforcement and minority communities. Her voice carried weight, not because she demanded attention, but because she spoke with honesty and experience. Still, there were moments when the weight of everything pressed heavily on her shoulders. Late at night, when the house was quiet, and the world outside seemed distant, she sometimes found herself replaying the incident in her mind. Not out of fear, but reflection. She thought about how quickly things could have gone differently, how easily a moment of aggression could turn into tragedy, but she also thought about the strength she had shown, the way she had remained composed under pressure. It reminded her why she had spent her life in service, to protect, to lead, and to stand firm in the face of adversity. One evening, while walking through her neighborhood, she ran into an old friend, James Carter, a fellow retired officer who had served alongside her during her early years in the Army. They hadn't spoken much since retiring, but seeing him brought back memories of long nights in base barracks, grueling missions overseas, and the unbreakable bond forged between soldiers who had fought side by side. "I watched your interview," James said after exchanging greetings. "I'm proud of you, Margaret. You handled that situation with more grace than most could ever manage." Margaret gave a small smile. "Thanks, James. It wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't let fear take over." James nodded. "That's always been your strength. You never let hate define you." They walked together for a while, reminiscing about their time in uniform, the people they had lost and the battles they had fought. Not just on foreign soil, but here at home, where prejudice still lingered in unexpected places. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the rooftops, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle within her. She knew the road ahead was long, that true change wouldn't come overnight. But she also knew that every voice raised in truth, every act of courage, contributed to something greater. Weeks turned into months. The media spotlight eventually moved on to other stories, but Margaret's impact remained. Schools invited her to speak, documentaries featured her journey, and young women of color cited her as inspiration when applying to military academies and law enforcement programs. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice, integrity, and the power of standing up for what's right. One day, while visiting the Veterans Center, she met a teenage girl named Layla, who had recently joined a youth leadership program designed to prepare young people for careers in public service. Layla looked up to Margaret with wide eyes, eager to hear anything she had to say. "Did you ever get scared?" Layla asked. Margaret paused, then answered honestly, "Yes, fear is natural, but fear doesn't have to control you. You learn to move past it, to use it as fuel." Layla nodded, taking in every word. Then she smiled. "I want to be like you, someday." Margaret placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "You already are. Just keep going." And so, life went on. Not unchanged, but moving forward nonetheless. The incident in the supermarket had shaken Brooksville, but it had also awakened something powerful, a collective realization that silence only feeds injustice. Margaret's courage had sparked conversations, inspired action, and reminded people that real heroes weren't just found on battlefields or in headlines, but in everyday moments where someone chooses to stand tall, speak truth, and refuse to be broken. And though she never sought fame or recognition, Colonel Margaret Ellison had become something more than a retired soldier. She had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit could shine through, if only we dared to let it. The months following Carl Dawson's conviction brought a wave of changes to Brooksville and beyond. The once quiet town had become the center of national attention, not just for the incident itself, but for the conversations it sparked about race, justice, and accountability in law enforcement. While some hoped the story would fade with time, others saw it as a turning point, one that could no longer be ignored. In the police department, reforms were slowly taking shape. The chief announced new policies aimed at improving transparency and trust between officers and the community. Mandatory bias training was introduced, and all recruits were now required to undergo extensive psychological evaluations before being hired. A civilian oversight board was also formed, giving local residents a voice in how complaints against officers were handled. These steps were met with cautious optimism by activists and concerned citizens alike, though many remained skeptical about whether real change would take root. Meanwhile, Colonel Margaret Ellison continued her work outside the spotlight. She turned down most media requests, preferring to focus on the causes she believed in rather than reliving the moment that had thrust her into public view. Still, her influence lingered. Her words were quoted in school presentations, her interviews replayed in classrooms across the country, and her name mentioned in discussions about leadership, courage, and integrity. One afternoon, while walking through the Veterans Center where she volunteered, she ran into a young man named Daniel Reyes. He was barely 20, dressed in a crisp uniform, preparing to ship out for basic training. He approached her hesitantly, clearly nervous. "I watched your interview," he said, his voice low. "I wanted to say thank you." Margaret smiled kindly. "For what?" "For showing me that I can serve with honor, even when people doubt me." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You already have what it takes, just remember. Service isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Daniel looked down at his boots, then back up at her. "That's what my dad used to say." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Was he in the military?" Daniel nodded. "He served 2 tours overseas. He passed away last year." A quiet silence settled between them. Margaret placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Then you come from a strong line. Carry that with you." Daniel gave a small smile, then walked off toward the exit, his posture straighter than before. As the seasons changed, so did the city around her. New faces joined the police force, officers who had grown up seeing the consequences of unchecked power and racial injustice. Some came seeking redemption for the failures of the past, others simply wanting to do better. Margaret made herself available to speak with them, offering advice based on her decades of experience. She didn't lecture or judge. Instead, she shared stories from her own journey, reminding them that leadership wasn't about authority, it was about responsibility. Back in court, the legal fallout from the incident continued. Though Dawson had been sentenced, civil lawsuits followed. Margaret was asked to testify in a case filed by the supermarket workers who had been traumatized. During the confrontation, she agreed, not for money but because she knew their voices deserved to be heard. The courtroom was quieter this time, the media presence smaller, but the weight of truth remained the same. During one session, a defense lawyer tried to challenge her account, suggesting that she might have provoked the officer. Margaret responded calmly without anger. "I've spent over 30 years in uniform," she said. "I know how to de-escalate situations. I didn't provoke anyone. I tried to prevent violence." Her testimony was powerful, measured, and unwavering. When the trial ended, the victims received financial compensation, and the store implemented new safety measures for employees. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was progress. Outside the courtroom, life went on. Margaret returned to her peaceful routines, early morning jogs, coffee with friends, long walks through familiar neighborhoods. But something had shifted within her. The world had seen her strength, but she had also seen something in return, a growing movement of people willing to stand up for what was right. She found comfort in knowing that her actions had sparked something bigger than herself. One evening, she sat on her porch watching the sunset, sipping tea as the sky turned shades of orange and purple. A neighbor stopped by. an older woman named Helen who had lived in Brooksville her whole life. "You know," Helen began, "I never really understood what people meant when they talked about racism until I saw that video." Margaret looked at her, curious. Helen sighed. "I thought it was just something that happened elsewhere. Not here, not in our town." Margaret nodded. "It happens everywhere. Sometimes we just don't see it until it hits close to home." Helen folded her hands in her lap. "Well, I see it now, and I want to do something about it." Margaret offered a warm smile. "That's all any of us can ask for." The conversation lasted well into the night, touching on everything from education to community policing, from personal biases to the importance of speaking up when things are wrong. By the time Helen left, both women felt lighter, as if some invisible burden had lifted. Weeks later, Margaret received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from a high school student named Layla Thompson, the same girl who had once told her, "I want to be like you someday." Now Layla had applied to a military academy and was waiting to hear back. "I'm still scared sometimes," she wrote. "But I think about what you said. That fear doesn't have to control you. So I keep going." Margaret read the letter twice, then placed it carefully inside a wooden box where she kept old photographs, medals, and notes from soldiers she had mentored over the years. Each item held a memory, a lesson, a piece of her journey. That night, she sat by the window again, looking out at the stars. The world was far from perfect, but she believed in its potential to grow. She had seen hatred, yes, but she had also seen courage, resilience, and the quiet strength of people choosing to do better. And in that moment, she knew her fight wasn't over. It never truly would be. But as long as there were people willing to listen, to learn, and to stand tall in the face of injustice, there was hope. So she took another sip of her tea, wrapped herself in the quiet night, and let the peace settle in, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to make a difference. The months rolled into a year, and the echoes of what happened in that Brooksville supermarket had not faded. The story had become more than just headlines or viral videos. It was now part of something bigger, a moment people would remember when talking about change, justice, and courage. For Colonel Margaret Ellison, life continued with a quiet strength that never wavered. She didn't seek the spotlight, but it often found her anyway. Invitations to speak at universities, town halls, and military events kept arriving in her mailbox. Some she accepted, others she politely declined, always choosing the ones where she felt she could truly make a difference. Back in Brooksville, the town was slowly healing. The police department, once under heavy scrutiny, had begun to rebuild trust with the community. Officers were attending neighborhood meetings, listening to concerns instead of brushing them aside. A new training program had been introduced, focusing on empathy, de-escalation, and cultural awareness. It wasn't perfect and not everyone agreed with every change, but for the first time in years, people felt like their voices mattered. Margaret often walked through the same supermarket where everything had changed. She didn't do it to relive the fear. She did it to remind herself that hate hadn't won. The employees still greeted her warmly, some even calling her by name. One cashier, a young man named David who had called 911 during the incident, had started volunteering with youth outreach programs, teaching kids about responsibility and respect. He once told Margaret, "I used to think my job was just scanning groceries. Now I know it's about being someone people can count on." One day, while walking through the Veterans Center where she volunteered, Margaret met a group of teenagers participating in a leadership program aimed at preparing young people for careers in public service. They sat around a table, notebooks open, eyes wide with curiosity as they listened to her stories. Not just about the confrontation with Carl Dawson, but about her time overseas, the soldiers she had trained, and the lessons she had learned along the way. A girl named Layla, who had written Margaret a letter months earlier, finally got to meet her in person. She stood up straighter, her voice steady despite her nerves. "You said something once," she began. "You said fear doesn't have to control you." Margaret smiled. "And does it?" Layla shook her head. "Not anymore." That answer meant more to Margaret than any medal ever had. She knew that real change didn't come from laws alone, or protests, or even speeches. It came from moments, like this, when a young person looked at someone else and saw proof that they could be strong too. Outside the walls of the Veterans Center, the country was changing as well. Across different cities, similar conversations were taking place. Police departments were reviewing policies, schools were adding new curriculum on civil rights history, and communities were finding ways to bridge divides. Some changes were slow, some faced resistance, but the movement had momentum, and Margaret's story was one of the sparks that helped light the fire. Back in Brooksville, a new community initiative was launched, a mentorship program pairing retired officers with young people interested in law enforcement or military service. The goal was simple: help shape future leaders with integrity, discipline, and a deep understanding of the responsibilities that came with power. Margaret was asked to be the program's first official advisor, a role she accepted without hesitation. At the first meeting, she stood in front of a room full of eager faces, young men and women from all backgrounds, each with dreams of serving their communities. She didn't give a long speech. Instead, she shared a few key lessons. Be ready to listen before you act. Understand that your uniform is not a shield, it's a promise. And never forget that true strength comes from doing what's right even when no one is watching. Her words stuck with them. Some took notes furiously, others simply nodded, absorbing every syllable. One boy raised his hand and asked, "What made you stay calm that day in the store?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Because I've seen fear turn into violence. I've seen how quickly things can spiral when someone lets anger take control. So I made a choice: to respond with calm, not chaos." The room stayed silent for a beat after that. Then another girl spoke up. "Do you still feel safe here?" Margaret looked around, then answered honestly, "Safety isn't about knowing nothing bad will ever happen. It's about knowing you can handle whatever comes your way." The students left that meeting with a little more confidence, a little more direction. Some would go on to join the military, others would apply to police academies, and a few might even end up shaping policy one day. But all of them carried a piece of Margaret's lesson with them. As the seasons passed, Margaret continued her work quietly but consistently. She spoke at graduations, wrote articles for local newspapers, and even helped design a national campaign encouraging young people to serve in public roles with honor and integrity. Her name remained tied to the incident in the supermarket, but it was no longer defined by it. Instead, it became known for something greater: the idea that one person's courage could inspire countless others. One evening, while sitting on her porch watching the stars, Margaret received a phone call from a familiar voice. Daniel Reyes, the young recruit she had met months earlier. His voice was excited, filled with pride. "I shipped out last week," he said, "and I wanted to thank you again for reminding me why I'm doing this." Margaret smiled. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep doing what's right." He laughed softly. "That's exactly what my dad used to say." They talked for a while, catching up, sharing stories. When they hung up, Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling lighter somehow. She knew she couldn't fix everything, couldn't erase every injustice, but she could plant seeds, ideas, values, examples of what it meant to lead with strength and dignity. And those seeds were growing. In Brooksville, across the country, and in places she may never visit, people were beginning to see the world a little differently, not because of laws alone, not because of protests, but because of stories like hers. Proof that courage could rise in the face of hatred, that truth could shine even in the darkest moments. And so, Margaret sat there in the quiet night, sipping her tea, watching the stars blink above, knowing that her fight had never really been about one moment in a supermarket. It had always been about what came after. Time moved forward, and the events of that day in the supermarket became part of Brooksville's past, but not its forgotten history. The town had changed, slowly but surely. Conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening in classrooms, town halls, and even in quiet conversations between neighbors. People who had lived side by side for years were finally seeing each other more clearly, not just as faces they passed on the street, but as individuals with stories, struggles, and shared hopes. Colonel Margaret Ellison continued her life with the same quiet strength that had carried her through war zones, leadership roles, and that terrifying moment in the grocery store aisle. She didn't seek fame or recognition, but she also understood the responsibility that came with her story. She still spoke at schools, met with young people interested in service, and worked behind the scenes to support veterans and police reform initiatives. Her presence was steady, like a lighthouse guiding others through uncertain waters. One afternoon, she visited a local high school where students were presenting projects on courage and social justice. As she walked into the auditorium, she saw posters on the walls, some showing famous civil rights leaders, others featuring news clippings from recent protests and speeches. And then there it was, a printed copy of the viral video still, showing her standing tall as Carl Dawson pointed a gun at her chest. Underneath it read, "Standing tall, when courage meets hate." A group of students greeted her eagerly, their eyes filled with admiration and curiosity. One girl, no older than 16, handed her a notebook. "We wrote about you," she said shyly. "We wanted to show how one person can make a difference." Margaret flipped through the pages, reading their words, stories of how her actions had inspired them to speak up when they saw injustice, to believe that they too could be leaders. She looked up, touched by the effort. "You all did good," she said simply. "Keep going." The presentation continued, and Margaret sat quietly, in the back, listening as students discussed what they had learned. They talked about fear, about the power of staying calm under pressure, and about the importance of speaking truth to power. She felt a deep sense of peace watching them. These were the future voices of change, and they were already learning. Back in the community, the reforms within the police department had begun to take root. Officers were undergoing new training programs focused on de-escalation, bias awareness, and community engagement. A new chief had been appointed, one who believed in transparency and accountability. While some officers resisted the changes, many younger recruits embraced them, understanding that true protection meant serving everyone equally. At a town meeting months later, a former officer stood up to speak. His name was Marcus Lee, a man who had retired after 25 years of service. He had once been skeptical about the need for reform, believing that the system mostly worked. But after watching the video of Margaret's confrontation, something shifted in him. "I used to think I knew what it meant to serve," he said into the microphone, his voice steady. "But I realize now that real service means protecting everyone, not just those who look like you or come from the same background." Colonel Ellison showed us that courage isn't about having power, it's about using it wisely. His words were met with respectful applause. Margaret sat in the audience, nodding silently. She knew that progress wasn't always fast, but moments like this reminded her that it was possible. Outside of official meetings and policy discussions, everyday people were making small but meaningful changes. Neighbors began organizing monthly community gatherings, bringing together families from different backgrounds to share food, stories, and ideas. Schools introduced new curriculums that included lessons on civil rights history, law enforcement, ethics, and the value of diversity. Even the local newspaper started publishing regular features highlighting residents who had made positive impacts in their neighborhoods. One evening, Margaret received a call from Layla Thompson, the young woman who had once written to her expressing her dream of joining the military. Now Layla was nearing the end of her first year at the academy and wanted to share an update. "I made it through basic training," she said excitedly over the phone, "and I'm doing well in my classes." Margaret smiled. "I told you, you've got what it takes." Layla hesitated before asking, "Do you ever get tired of fighting for what's right?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I don't see it as fighting. I see it as building something better. And every time I see someone like you taking steps forward, I know it's worth it." Layla was silent for a beat, then softly replied, Thank you, Colonel. As the conversation ended, Margaret placed the phone down and looked out her window. The sky was dark, stars scattered across it like tiny points of hope. She thought about the journey she had taken, from the battlefield to a quiet town, from uniformed service to a fight for justice in a place she had hoped would never test her again. But she had faced that test, and she had stood firm. Months later, she was invited to speak at a national conference on leadership and ethics in public service. The room was filled with hundreds of people, military personnel, law enforcement officers, educators, and students. She stepped onto the stage, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as someone who had lived through a moment that revealed deeper truths about the world. She spoke about discipline, about the power of remaining grounded in crisis, and about the responsibility that came with authority. Leadership isn't about control, she said. It's about choice. Every day we choose how we treat others, how we protect our communities, how we shape the future. After the speech, several people approached her with questions, gratitude, and personal stories. Some were young cadets preparing for their first assignments. Others were officers seeking advice on handling difficult situations with integrity. All of them left feeling inspired. That night, as she returned home, Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew she couldn't change the entire world, but she had done her part. She had shown that hate could be met with dignity, that fear could be answered with calm resolve, and that one person's actions could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what they could see. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the moonlight dance across the rooftops. Somewhere a new generation was rising, one that had seen her story, learned from it, and would carry its lessons forward. And in that quiet moment, Margaret Ellison allowed herself to smile, not because the fight was over, but because she knew it would continue long after she was gone, because hope, like courage, was never truly finished. It only passed from one hand to the next, waiting for the next person ready to stand tall.